Hello and welcome to this video on wage rate determination. In this video we're going to look at how the supply and demand of labour can illustrate the labour market, and we're going to look at government intervention in the labour market as well. So let's start off with wage determination. So far we have looked at the demand for labour and the labour curve, the labour demand curve, and the supply of labour, the labour supply curve. And what we can see here is that the market equilibrium wage rate is where the supply and demand for labour intersect. So at this wage rate here of W1, the amount of demand for labour and the amount of supply for labour are exactly the same, this number of workers. So we have a stable equilibrium wage rate at W1. And if there was to be an increase in demand for labour, then this would see a shift in the demand curve to the right, a rise to the right, and this would move our equilibrium wage rates higher from W1 to W2. Similarly, if there was an outward shift in the labour supply, this would see supply rise to the right, and there would be a reduction in the wage rate from W1 to W2. So we can use shifts in supply of labour, shifts in demand for labour to illustrate what might be happening to wage rates in a particular market. Now, if wages are too high, what this is creating, or what this means, is that labour supplied will be greater than the level demanded. So at a wage rate of W2, we would have E2 number of people who are willing to supply their labour. However, at W2, we would only have E3 amount of workers actually wanted by businesses. So in this situation, we have a big gap between the two. We have workers who are willing and able to work, but haven't got a job. So in this situation, we would say that a wage rate of W2, our market is not in equilibrium, and that's going to create unemployment. People in the workforce who are willing and able to work, but don't have a job at the moment. In this situation, we would expect market forces, if they were to operate freely, would push the wage rate W2 back down towards an equilibrium position where the level of workers supplied equals the level of workers demanded. Let's talk about unemployment briefly. So unemployment is when potential workers are without jobs. And we define potential workers as those being of working age. So we're really talking about here people here between being a child and being a retired adult. So in the UK it's 16 to 64, but it changes amongst other countries, and it's normally around these sorts of figures. The unemployment rate is the percentage of those people, the labour force, who don't have jobs. Now, the level of unemployed people in the economy can go up and down because a lot of different categories are involved in whether you're actually unemployed or not. So for example, if you were to enter full-time education as a university student, you wouldn't be counted as unemployed. You've left the stock of unemployed people. You're actually now classed as being economically inactive. If you were still of working age, but you had retired early, we wouldn't count you as being unemployed. We would say you've left the kind of workforce, you are economically inactive. If you did university after your degree, but then you couldn't find a job but you were looking for one, we would say that you were unemployed and you were contributing to the number of unemployed people in the economy. So how do unemployment figures break down? Well, we take the population as a whole. We then remove retired pensioners and children under 18 or 16, depending on the country, and so we get the working age population. Then from this, we remove all the economically inactive people, so people like students, people who have taken early retirement, and from that we get the labour force. And then we remove the people who have jobs, and we're left with those poor unfortunate souls who are unemployed. Another concept we need to be aware of is underemployment. And this occurs when someone is currently in employment but would like to work longer hours or perhaps in a higher paid job. And this is particularly relevant since the recession in 2008, where we see people with good degrees who are qualified to do higher, better paid jobs actually not working as much as they could do or for as much pay as they would like. So that's an issue occasionally when wages are too high. If wages are too low, then there will be a similar scenario. Now, if wages are very low at W2, then not many people will want to supply their labour, will want to work. They might think, I'd rather have more leisure time perhaps because it's not worth working. On the flip side of that, when the wage rate is quite low, we will see quite a large or high demand for workers. So in this situation, we have a gap between the amount of workers making themselves available and the amount of workers that businesses want to hire. So in this situation, we have a labour shortage. We have too few workers than the ones we would like. So in this situation, what we would expect is where we've got demand outstripping supply, is that market forces will take over and the market wage rate should rise towards an equilibrium position. Now, some governments introduce a national minimum wage, and that is a statutory, and by statutory we mean a legal pay floor. So by law, you can't go lower than that pay rate. So for example, in July 2014, Germany voted to introduce a minimum wage of €8.50 per hour for the first time, and by law, you couldn't pay someone below that wage rate. So let's have a look at how this might work in practice in our market. So imagine a current scenario where we have a wage rate of W1, and this would lead to employment of E1. Now, the government might decide that actually W1 is too low. It's too low a wage rate to guarantee people a good standard of living. So we're going to pass a law saying that the wage cannot drop between W2. So now any worker who works has to receive W2. What does this do in our market? Well, actually, this creates a situation where the demand for labour is actually E2, whereas the supply of labour now at the higher minimum wage is actually E3. So many economists would argue that introducing a national minimum wage and not allowing the labour market to function freely just creates a labour surplus or unemployment. So what would be the arguments for and against the minimum wage? Well, if we look on the for side, the main justification is that it's fairer. It's a fair level of pay for those people who have jobs. Secondly, it can reduce poverty. Thirdly, it encourages firms to train their workers to make it worthwhile paying them that minimum wage. They actually contribute something in terms of output. It provides an incentive for people to come and work rather than stay at home or perhaps take benefits. And it's a way of tackling discrimination against groups of workers who might otherwise not be fairly treated in the workplace in terms of pay. Any arguments against? Well, the biggest argument, and this is debatable, is that some economists argue that this creates unemployment. Small businesses in particular might see problems with their levels of profits if they have to pay workers higher wage rates than they were paying them before. If you're going to train workers, maybe there are other ways of doing it rather than introducing a minimum wage. It might make businesses less competitive because their costs have gone up and they have to put their prices up, and they might struggle with foreign businesses to compete. And also it might add to price rises in the economy. If a business has higher labour costs, they might put their prices up, which creates inflation in the economy. A theoretical idea, although very rarely used in practice, is the idea that government could introduce a maximum wage. So let's imagine we have a market here with a wage rate of W1. But the government think this is maybe a bit obscene. Perhaps you might think of footballers and they think no one should be paid that much. So they introduce a maximum wage, and they say that actually the maximum wage that can legally be charged is W2. Now, what would that do in our market? Well, actually at W2, we would create a shortage of, for example, footballers. Only this many people, E2, would supply their labour as footballers, whereas E3 would be the level of footballers demanded by clubs. So in this situation, we have a gap between the two, and our maximum wage has created a labour shortage. There's more workers required than workers available. So in this video, we've looked at supply and demand of labour, how that can illustrate market equilibrium in the labour market. And we've also looked at government intervention, which is mainly focused around national minimum wage, the case for and the case against. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.